this afternoon to introduce Marc Schatzberger, who's come over from York to talk about his own incredible journey in the midst of one of the most horrendous human acts of civilized times. So I'm expecting it to be a very moving talk, and I'm sure you'll have loads of questions. So without further ado, welcome Marc, thanks for coming, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. First things first, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Can you hear me like this? Yes. We'll forget about the mic then, shall we? Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. I've come here today to talk about the Holocaust. And the definition of the word Holocaust is a large-scale slaughter or destruction of life. So this is going to be a serious hour that we're going to spend together. And the object of the exercise is to show how bad things can develop from quite ordinary, standard way of life. My name is Marc Schatzberger. I was born in 1926, which makes me nearly 93. Halfway between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. And I was born in Vienna, which is the capital of Austria. Vienna is shown here. It's a capital city, and it's positioned in Austria. Okay, it doesn't look too clever for me. Can you see it okay? Yes. Right, well, Austria is the yellow bit. It's right in the center of Europe. There's us over there. There's Austria. Germany is the blue bit here. That's significant because Germany and Austria are both German-speaking countries. It's the same language, it sounds a little bit different, and it's a similar relationship between the languages as between English and American English. When you hear an American speak, you know he's American because of the way it sounds. When you are an Austrian and you speak, a German will be able to tell straight away that you are an Austrian, but it's the same language. To the right of Central Europe, there is the vast amount of space which is filled by what we call Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, all sorts of places, and Russia. And in the 19th century, that is the 1850s, 1860s, there were a lot of Jewish families living in Eastern Europe. And the Eastern European countries at the time were very anti-Semitic. And that expressed itself in their laws, which stated that Jews may not occupy certain trades, Jews may not, excuse me, may not be educated beyond the age of 13, and stuff like that. And moreover, there were actually state supported programs, what they called programs. They were actions, physical actions of destruction of Jewish dwellings, and it became quite difficult for Jewish people in Eastern Europe to have normal lives, and there was a general influx from Eastern Europe to the West. And when you go from the east to the west, you get to Austria and you get to Germany. And Austria and Germany at that time, remember I'm speaking about the mid-18, the 50s, 60s, 70s, both these countries were quite receptive of Jewish families. And so a lot of Jewish families settled in Vienna, because Vienna is actually about here, right on the eastern side. And Vienna, in any case, was the capital of Austria, which has which at the time had about 6 million inhabitants, of whom 1.5 million lived in Vienna. So Vienna was a capital in the real sense of the word, apart from the fact that it had also been the imperial capital of the Habsburg Empire, which had existed for 1,000 years in the whole of Europe. So there they were, and my mother and father, who were actually born in Poland, and were amongst the families who moved, who fled, if you like, from Poland to the west, to Vienna, and settled in Vienna, were Jewish. So I'm a Jew. Jewish people at that time, there were about 120,000 Jews living in Vienna at that time, of a population of 1.5 million. So if you had if you picked at random a dozen people from the street and invited them to your house, the odds were that one of them would be Jewish. And they occupied all kinds of positions, right across the whole social spectrum, from the top, from politics and the arts and the sciences and medicine and music and architecture, right down to the trades and shopkeepers and so on. My father, because he was of conscription age, enlisted in the Austrian army in the First World War and fought on the front line. He got wounded, he got a medal, he felt, when he came back from the war, he felt himself to be an Austrian citizen. My mother also had settled in Vienna, and they were Austrians. My father worked his way up from being an enlisted soldier. He worked his way up in a transport firm. I suppose you would call it logistics nowadays. It's a company who which transported goods from one part of Europe to another. There were very few flights in those days. In fact, there weren't any to start with. All transport was by rail or by truck, by road, or by canal. And he worked his way up and became the managing director of this little company. And he was well respected by his colleagues and by his staff. My mother studied music at the Vienna High School of Music, which was quite a renowned place to be in the world of music, and she became a musician. And they had me in 1926. I was an only child, and I did all the things that a kid does. I had a happy childhood, and if I can see what's what here. Yes, since Austria has a continental climate, continental climate means, by the way, am I in the way of your sight? Can you see what am I in the way? Can you see? Yes, yes.
You're okay, you're fine.
Right. I was a happy kid. In summer, my mother took me to this place. It was called Eichmünster, and it was a lake surrounded by mountains. Every summer, we had a rented room in this little village, and I splashed about in the lake with other kids. And at weekends, my father would come from Vienna. He was working in Vienna, and he would come out and spend the weekend with us, and spent a happy 4 or 5 weeks there. And in winter, let's see. In winter, if you had an outdoor tennis court and you had a hose pipe and you doused the tennis court with water on a Thursday afternoon, on a Friday morning you could play ice hockey on it. And that's me and my mate pretending to play ice hockey. And this is the sort of life I led. And things were fine. Then in 1933, which was when I was 7 years old, in 1933, an event happened in neighboring Germany, which was that an ordinary democratic vote resulted in a party called the Nationalsozialistische Partei, National, which was led by a man called Adolf Hitler, came to power. And the Nazi Party was born, Nazi Party was born. And as soon as the Nazis came to power, the whole atmosphere in Germany changed completely, because Hitler, amongst his various schemes, had one phobia, which was that the Jews were responsible for everything, but everything that went wrong in Germany after the First World War. Which meant that there was an immediate atmosphere of vituperation, of blaming, of propaganda against the Jews. And there was the introduction of two things. The introduction, number one, was of two different quasi military groups of people. One was the SS, Sturmstaffeln. They were the guys that are usually depicted on films, quite accurately depicted, as wearing black uniforms, black hats, and black, white and red, and armbands with a swastika. And they were the elite. They called the shots. And then there was the SA, Sturmabteilung, and they wore brown trousers and brown tunics, and they were the thugs. Yes, they were the thugs. They were actually collected, they were chosen from the lowest part of the German population. Why was there such a thing as thugs? Well, there was also the second item that was introduced was the item of concentration camps. Concentration camps were places you got put in for no reason other than you were against the party, the Nazi party, and specifically you were put in if there was no reason other than that you happened to be Jewish. Now, there is, you might say it's like being in a prison, but it's not like a prison. When you are in prison, it's because you have been tried in a court of law, and you've been found guilty of some kind of offense or of a crime, and you are put in a prison, and you are subject to certain rules, and the people who are running the prison are subject to a set of rules. A concentration camp is not like that. A concentration camp is a place you get put because you got put there. And you got put there by the thugs in brown, and they put you there for no reason other than one of the chaps in black said, you better take this fella and get him to wherever, to the concentration camp. And concentration camps where people had the people who were running the camps had no rules that they had to obey. And they could virtually do whatever their fancy took them. It so happened that my wife's uncle, who was a chap in his 30s at the time, was taken like that for no reason other than he was a Jew. And he was taken to a concentration camp called Dachau, near Munich. And fortunately, by some fluke, he managed to get out of there after a few months being in Dachau. And ultimately, after a long time, he actually finished up in this country, and he went blind. And he was living in Manchester at the time. He went to Manchester Eye Clinic, and they diagnosed that his optic nerves had been physically damaged. At which point he, for the first time, confided that when he was in Dachau, he was beaten up. Simply, he was beaten up. He was the beating that he had received at that point resulted in his becoming blind at the age of about late 60s, and he died aged about 70-something, a totally blind old man. That was at concentration camps. And in 1935, there was a political conference in a city called Nuremberg, which resulted in the what is now known as the Nuremberg Laws, which went to great trouble to define what constitutes being Jewish. It was so important for Hitler and the Nazi Party to exactly define people's Jewishness or lack of Jewishness, that they had a political discussion about it and created a set of laws which not only tried to define what grade of Jewishness you were if you had a grandmother and two great-grandparents who were Jewish, but also forbade Jews and non-Jews to fraternize, to have sexual relations, or even to marry. There were a whole other sets of laws. They were deprived of German citizenship. Imagine, you're British citizens, and somebody suddenly says to you, you're not a British citizen anymore. You can't use the health service, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have a passport. Finished. So things became quite difficult for Jewish people. And all the time, there was this emphasis on Jews. Forward. Or another one. Yeah. Now, what you're seeing here is a board game. A board game directed at kids of younger than you, much younger than you. And as board games usually are, they have a little label on the lid, inside the lid of the box, which says what the objective is and how you play the game. The name of this game is Juden raus, which is Jews out. And the first thing it said on this piece of paper down there, try your luck with the dice. Catch Your Own Jew. This is directed at 8-year and 9-year-olds. Can you imagine? And they had mathematical textbooks, and the examples of sums which they gave for adding and subtracting and dividing and multiplying was all about the taxes which the Jews evaded. It was quite ridiculous. Well, anyhow, another part of the propaganda machinery which Hitler had put in place persuaded the German people that they needed more living space. Lebensraum, they called it. More living space. And so the thought was born that it would be a good idea to annex Austria, because they were, after all, they spoke in German as well. So in March 1938, in 1938, Hitler decided to simply march into Austria, complete with an army, fully armed army, with the jackboots and the rifles, with the mounted bayonets, marching into Austria and right across Austria into Vienna. I was a kid of, what was I, 11 at that time. 12. Yes, I was 12. And I had just moved from primary school into grammar school. And there they were. And days after Hitler had annexed Austria, and Austria ceased to exist as a separate country, and it became the Ostmark, the eastern county of Germany. And suddenly a lot of our teachers who happened to be Jewish disappeared. And a lot of the teachers which remained came in wearing the swastikas on their arms. And I don't know if you know this, but at that time, schoolrooms looked quite different to schoolrooms do now. What you had was little desks, each with two people at each desk. And there was a blackboard, a podium which was this high. There was a row of 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 little desks, and then another row and another row. So you were sitting in an orderly fashion, and you always sat with the same person. And I sat with a mate that we'd been mates ever since we joined that school, which was a year earlier. And his name was Günther, and I chatted with Günther, as I very often did, and he was not very responsive. He kind of just shut up. And I couldn't get anything out of him at all. And I said to my mum and dad when I got home, Günther's not talking to me. And they explained what it probably was. If you are found to be friendly towards Jews, you are immediately ostracized. And it was very likely that if you are friendly towards Jews, the Gestapo, the Gestapo was the secret police, would know about it because they had eyes and ears everywhere. They would know about it. And if your father happened to be a decorator and he decorated a flat that belonged to a Jewish family, he would never get another job. So there was an intimidation going on throughout the country in order to widen the anti-Semitism which already existed in the background. And things got really quite bad in Vienna. For example, since families in Vienna lived in large blocks of flats rather than in individual houses, kids were dependent on parks and open spaces for playing and forming friendships and little groups, little gangs, if you like. And from day one of Hitler's occupation of Austria, Jewish children were not allowed to play in parks. Jewish people were not allowed to sit down on benches. Jewish shops had to have placards on their entrance doors saying, "This is a Jewish shop." Stuff of that nature. And of course, unemployment rose tremendously, because I already told you about 8% of people in employment or any people in Vienna were Jews. So suddenly a lot of people were unemployed and they were all Jews. And then you started having to go, instead of being in an ordinary school, you had to be educated in a Jewish school. Now, 120,000 people includes a lot of Jewish children. And there were only 2 or 3 Jewish schools that were just Jewish. And so there was a vast amount of overcrowding of Jewish schools, with children coming in from all over non-general schools. So things had suddenly become extremely difficult. And there was something even more telling. A young man whose family was stuck. He was a German, actually, not an Austrian. This German young man had managed to emigrate to France, and whilst in Paris, he was trying to get his family to join him, and he foolishly took it upon himself one day, because he was unable to get permissions to have his family joining him. He took it on himself to go to the German embassy in Paris and to assassinate a high-ranking German diplomat. And when word got round to Mr. Hitler that had happened, he declared open season on Jews throughout Germany, which included Austria. By that I mean that he actively encouraged people to vandalize Jewish property and Jewish people to an extent which is virtually unheard of. Synagogues were decimated. Jewish shops were broken into and the stock was pilfered. There was glass all over the place, which is the reason why the event has now become known as Kristallnacht, the night of crystal, of broken crystal, broken glass, in fact. And when Kristallnacht was the outpourings of the worst feelings that a population is capable of. And things became so bad that the Jews in Vienna and in Germany decided that they could not possibly stay where they were. They had to get out. They had to emigrate. And in order to emigrate, you got to find somewhere to immigrate into. And that is not easy, as we all know. So queues started forming at the various embassies in Vienna and in Berlin and in Frankfurt and in all other major German cities. Excuse me. And unfortunately, because my father was so sure of being, if you like, of his status and of his friendship with various people and his popularity with everybody and his quite well-known patriotism of Austria. My father had not made any efforts, like many other Jews had done, of trying to find somewhere to go to emigrate to. And when he knew that he had to emigrate, but that it was too late, really. There were the queues in the various embassies were too long. And I mean, Britain, for example, Britain was a favorite place to come to for a number of reasons. Reason number one was, I don't know how much you know about that history at the moment. Now, I'm sure you do know that at the time, Britain was the overwhelming power on this globe. It was the biggest, most powerful, most looked up to country in the world. And whatever was English, but they meant British, but it was always England. Whatever was England was good. And people wanted to go to England. And England at the time had unemployment. We're talking about 1938, 39. There was a problem of unemployment, and there was a law. The British Home Office accepted Jewish adults only if they were prepared to come as domestic servants. British people did not, although there was unemployment, British people were not keen to become domestic servants, and so they were the only jobs available. And in order to get such jobs, you had to find a household, a couple or a household that would accept you and guarantee to the Chancellor of the Exchequer that you would not be a financial burden on the state. So that was difficult to find anyway. It was all the more difficult if you were on the back of the queue, and all the more difficult if you had dallied and not got into the queue in the first place. But at the same time, the British government decided to accept up to 10,000 unaccompanied children to be to have a home in this country. Up to 10,000. We are currently talking about 500 refugees from Syria and 200 from there and 200. And in those days, they were big enough to say 10,000 kids could come. But they had to be unaccompanied. So there was a concerted queue for Jewish people to decide to send their kids away from their own influence to come to England. And one day, my mother and father sat me down and said, "How do you feel about going to England by yourself?" And I said, I was 12. How do you answer that? I said, "I don't know. What do you think I should do?" And they looked at one another and they said, "I think you should go." So I said, "Okay, I'll go." And I managed to get onto one of these Kindertransports in May 1939. And let me just... Yes. This is the day arrived when I was supposed to go, and the train left Vienna at 9 o'clock or something like that in the evening in May. And we got to the station, and there were about 60 or 70 other Jewish families letting their children go on this transport, this Kindertransport. I was an only child. So we all had little things like hanging around our necks with a cardboard, about 6-inch square cardboard with a big number on it. And that number was you. And there was one adult who was in charge of taking this group of children, depositing them in London, and then going back again. He was not allowed to stay. He had to go back again. I was one of these, and on the train, I wrote this postcard, which has a German stamp on it, so I had to post it when the when the train stopped in a German place. And I had to scramble out of the compartment and to postbox and scramble back in to not to miss the train. And in this in this letter, I've got a transcription of what I said in this letter. Yes. Yes, that's it. Yes, I wrote it, and I've got this card. In fact, this card is presently an exhibit at a freshly started memorial at Huddersfield of the Holocaust. It's just there as an exhibit, and it says this: "Dear Mum and Dad, now your boy's gone. Can't be helped. I'm having a good time. There are only 6 of us boys in the compartment. After our departure at 10:45 p.m., we messed about with our torches. Then we told jokes, and then, as there was plenty of space, we lay or sat down to get some sleep. Exactly at 11:39, the train stopped miles from anywhere, but soon continued. This often happened, but seems quite harmless. It wasn't harmless at all. When it happened, the soldiers boarded the train, doors were banged, and bellicose noises were made. They didn't harm us, but they looked and acted as though they would at any moment. Anyway, just now we came through Passau, which used to be the Austrian border station. A few minutes ago, I stitched the loop on my raincoat. I had the sewing kit in my first aid box. I also ate some food, and I'm well and truly ready to face the journey. And then, obviously, that was after I woke up. I slept very well, and I'm quite fresh. My handwriting is wobbly because of the movement of the train. I'm looking out of the window. It is 4:30 and already quite light. I still have my number tag round my neck. The lads are very nice, and we are having a good chat. Everything's fine except my rucksack's a bit too big. Lots of love, you. So that's what I wrote, and we went on to Hoek van Holland, from Germany up through Holland to Hoek van Holland, which is a ferry port, and embarked on a ferry which took us to Harwich, and we arrived. This is a picture that was taken at Harwich as we disembarked from the ferry, and it's strange. This picture actually, I didn't know it had been taken. I happened to be on it. I'm this guy there with the thing around him. I found this picture in a thick book which somebody had written much later, at the end, after the end of the war, depicting the Kindertransports in general. And I found this picture the frontispiece of that book was that picture. So I took it and appropriated it to show you, and students like you. We got to Harwich, and you see us all grinning like Cheshire cats. And the reason we were grinning is because we had this feeling of freedom. Now you might well ask, why would we grin because of freedom? You wouldn't grin because you're free. You damn well expect to be free. You have a right to expect to be free. It's not a big deal to be free, but it was for us. And it was, young as we were, and as you can see, among the older ones, these people were maybe 7 or 8 years old, and there were even younger ones. They were happy to be in this country. And when we then went on by train to London, we arrived at Liverpool Street Station. And at Liverpool Street Station, there is now, at this moment, and has been for some time, this little statue of children arriving on the Kindertransport. All of the 10,000 kids that were accepted by the British government arrived at Liverpool Street Station, and this is in memory of them arriving, and you can see them all with their belongings. Little violin down there. I personally had a little accordion, which was very dear to me, which my father bought me when I was about 8 or 9, because my mother had tried to teach me the piano, and like any other little boy, I was too lazy to practice, and so she gave me up. But when I got the accordion, I could play it within half an hour of receiving it. And I've had an accordion ever since. But my hearing now is so bad that when I play the wrong note, I can't hear it, so I've given up playing. So I was taken from Liverpool Street Station to a youth, a Jewish children's hostel in Margate. And Margate was a pleasant enough place, but I need to tell you, the time is running out a bit, but I must really go back to the Holocaust, because I was in contact with my parents constantly, letters from Margate to Vienna and from Vienna to Margate for a number of weeks, until one day I got a note from them. At last they had managed to find somebody in England to accept them as domestic servants, and they had got all the permissions and all the certificates and all the visas and all the train tickets and everything. And they were arriving in England on the 15th of September, 1939. And on the 6th of September, 1939, Mr. Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, declared war on Germany. And so my parents were now enemy aliens, and there wasn't a cat in hell's chance for them to come over. And I had plenty of notice, not directly from my parents ever since then, but in general, of people being rounded up, not only in German cities like Vienna, but also in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia and in Romania and in Bulgaria. All Jewish people were rounded up and transported in a most inhuman way to various places, of which some were labor camps, some were just camps in which people were allowed to just die of starvation. There were some places where they were forced to march from one place to another on death marches, from one labor place to another, slave labors, and to other places like Auschwitz. Well, there's only one Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was a place which my parents found themselves in, my parents and other members of my family. And there's a story that an old chap, a friend of mine in Leeds, told me that he and his family had been transported to Auschwitz. And there was he and his son and his wife and his daughter. And when they got to Auschwitz, after being transported in a cattle truck, standing in this very cramped truck for 2 days and two nights, they got out and they were told to go up a gangway, and at the end of that gangway there's a bloke who decided, go this way or go that way. And he decided his wife and his daughter to go that way, and his brother, it was his brother, and he went that way. And he was worried about this, and he turned to a guard and said, "Can you please tell me where are they going?" And the guard silently pointed to the top of a chimney which was smoking. Didn't say a word. And this chap said, I never saw them again. They were burned like you would burn some rubbish that you've been put into bins. And it's true. People who went to Auschwitz were accommodated in wooden barracks. And if it was a turn of that particular barrack, you were told to go to this building over there. You go in that building, get rid of all your clothes, go through that door. Somebody turns on a tap, and big shower heads dispensed gas. And you were subjected to this gas, and you took between 12 and 15 minutes to die. And then you were dead, and then you were smoke. And this is what we call the Holocaust. And in the Holocaust, there were 6 million people who were killed. Most of them, not all of them, but the vast majority of them were Jews. And in Auschwitz itself, there was 1 million. Now, when I say 6 million, you know, it's 6 and 3 and 6 noughts. What does 1 million, what does 6 million mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means every man, woman, and child of every city and village of all the counties of Yorkshire, South, North, East, and West Yorkshire, plus all the people in Greater Manchester. That's what 6 million people are. And that's what the Holocaust means. There are a lot of things that are going on at this time in the world which are referred to as a Holocaust. And quite rightly, there are things that are unfortunately associated with the taking of life, with a Holocaust. But there's only one, the Holocaust. And that is it. 6 million. And with that, I know we've overshot the time, but I wanted you to know why I'm here. I want you to go away and remember, when you have your own children, tell them that these things have happened. Otherwise, they just become pages in a dry history book, and nobody reads them. Tell them that out of nothing, out of normal lives, if you foster discrimination of the kind that I've described, then you're going to get a Holocaust. That's the end.
Thank you so much for that really moving depiction of an extraordinary time. Thank you very much for coming. I'll leave you to answer questions. Then before I go to work, to remember that everything I'll talk about came from a democratically elected government. And I think all of you are approaching the age, or their parts already, where you will have a vote. And it's really important that you exercise that vote against hatred and intolerance and prejudice. And do that responsibly. Thank you for coming. Really grateful.
Any questions at all?
What was your parents' experience of Auschwitz?
There's very little I know about their experience in Auschwitz, because I only got to know that they lost their lives in Auschwitz when, at the end of 1945, I received a letter in a brown envelope, a very official letter from the International Red Cross, to say, we have to inform you that Mr. Maximilian Schatzberger, Mrs. Ida Schatzberger, Mr. Philip Schatzberger, Mrs. Gisela Schatzberger died at Auschwitz on such and such a date. That's all I know.
Did you go to, was it kind of like an orphanage, or did you get fostered into families?
Did you go to an orphanage or were you fostered into a family?
After when I was in Margate at the children's hostel, I stayed there for a number of weeks, and then an uncle and aunt of mine, a sister of my father and her husband, managed to get over, and they arranged for me to, they came over as domestic servants at a place in Huyton near Liverpool, at some titled outfit. And they took me and arranged, with the help of the Jewish aid committee, to be accommodated at a family in Liverpool. Huyton was near Liverpool. And from there, very checkered history. I went to school in Liverpool. Of course I didn't know any English, but I went to school, and the kids at school were extremely helpful. When the teacher said something that I clearly couldn't understand, they would tell me, try to tell me what was required, and it was a very good experience, really, very good. And then I had, when you are a refugee, you don't just get a different language, you get a different life, you get different things happening. Your education system is different. I've always wanted to be an engineer, but in German the word ingenieur and in English the word engineer are very similar, but the job is not the same. An engineer in my what I was talking about is a guy who makes things happen, from going to Mars and landing on Mars to splitting the atom. Whereas an engineer in this country is involved in these sort of things, as well as repairing your washing machine. It's all the same word. So I wanted to be one of the others, one of the professional ones. And I managed it in a very lopsided way. I studied for a matriculation at home with the help of Cambridge Matriculation Board exam papers, old papers, and I managed matric, and then I got a place at Manchester Central High School, and I got the equivalent of a City Scholarship to go to Manchester University, UMIST, and so on. It's a long story.
Did you experience any prejudice in the UK during the war?
No. The answer is a decisive no. But my wife, who has a similar background to mine, and who came with her family again in domestic service, and who went to a school in Royston near Cambridge. The kids there taunted her as being a Nazi, which was, of course, the exact opposite to what she was, but she had that experience. But apart from that, I would say we both were quite We didn't look for offence, and we didn't receive any.
Do you feel like anti-Semitism is on the rise in England or in the UK?
I think it's on the rise again. There was a lull. I don't know. This is politics, really. In a way, there's a rise because there is a growing awareness of differences in religion. For example, Muslims and Christians lived perfectly happily for goodness knows how long in this country and in other countries. Jews and Christians and Muslims can and have in the past lived perfectly harmoniously together. And because there is a lot of emphasis on religion-based animosities, there's a spin-off for anti-Semitism as well. It's just something that is in our power, in our power to avoid. We ought not to submit to it. We ought not to allow it. We ought not to practice it.
Does the way politics is going in the whole of Europe, does that make you worried at all?
Well, the whole of Europe, it's very hard, really, to speak of that without taking a view on Brexit. I don't want to be controversial about Brexit, but I do know that there was a fear that one possible outcome of Britain leaving Europe would be that there was then going to be a movement in Europe for other nations also to go out. And that's a concern, because there is no century that I've ever seen a history book where there has not been a war between European nations with each other until now. And the existence of the European Union appears to me to be a way of preventing that. Having said that, there's a growth in some countries to the right, where nationalism is raising its head. Poland, Hungary, to some extent Holland, and there is, on the other hand, Spain, who have voted socialists as the biggest party just yesterday. So the honest answer is I don't know.
Where you used to live in Austria, how is that different now?
Austria has changed a lot. Austria, of course, Austria was jubilant when Hitler marched in. Let us not make any mistakes about that. There were a large number of people who were jubilant about Hitler. And since then, For a number of years after the end of the war, Austria pretended to be a victim of the Nazis rather than a perpetrator, which was wrong. But then there was a change in the government of Austria about, I don't know, in the 70s, when at last they made an official admission that Austria had been perpetrators rather than victims, that this was no longer the case, that they had instituted a period of re-education of Austrian recent history. And indeed, my wife and I were both involved with a lot of other Jewish people from across the whole world, traveling to Austria and speaking at schools in the same way as I'm speaking here now about the Holocaust, about the Nazis. I now find, I've been back to Austria many times, it's a thoroughly civilized place, as it always has been before Hitler. It's a place in which I feel happy, but I wouldn't go back as a citizen. I'm a citizen of this country.
Have you ever visited one of the camps?
Pardon?
Have you ever visited one of the camps?
I have not. I have been very close to Auschwitz and to Dachau and to Buchenwald. And whilst I thoroughly welcome the idea of making these places available as sort of museums and memorials to what has happened, I have never felt emotionally able to go to them.
This afternoon, for listening to Mark's questions and listening to his speech and taking on board that message about treat people equally and not discriminating against people. So if we can just give Mark another round of applause.